Hi everyone, I'm Nishtha.
Hi everyone, this is Sukanya.
To those of you who are joining us from the last season, welcome back. We are so excited to have you, and especially on this new season of Intersectional Feminism, Desi Style. Last season, we were talking about how different identities overlap to form our lived experiences. And this season, we will be talking about more of that, but also we will be talking about a lot of things pop culture. In fact, all things pop culture. And I'm so excited to introduce to you our new season and our new host, our content editor, Sukanya. Hi, Sukanya. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you, Nishtha. I'm equally excited to be on the podcast. So, to our listeners, to give you a brief on what this season is going to be about, like Nishtha said, this season we're going to speak about everything pop culture. And pop culture, as we all know, is everywhere. Be it information, news, memes, social media, whatever it is, you name it, and you have a pop culture format to it. So it is something that we have all been consuming and we consume it all the time. And because we consume it all the time, it is also such a big influence on our mindsets and our worldview, which is why it is very, very important to then scrutinize it for the political undertones that it carries. So, this season, we are going to speak about pop culture and the importance of looking at pop culture through a feminist lens.
And I think that for our first episode and really to open this season, we couldn't have asked for a better guest than who we have on our show today. We have with us Anna M.M. Vetticad, who's a leading film critic and has been a journalist for 26 years now. She's also the author of the critically acclaimed bestseller, The Adventures of an Intrepid Film Critic. In her illustrious career, she's worked with major media organizations such as India Today, Indian Express, and Headlines Today. Currently, as an independent journalist, she has bylines in The Caravan, First Post, Forbes, Al Jazeera, and many, many more. She's also received the prestigious Ramnath Goenka Award in 2015. And the best part is she's fiercely feminist in her film reviews, and we are so excited about that. Anna, thank you so very much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me, and not just fiercely feminist, but the world's most committed feminist, as my Twitter bio says.
Well, we love that. So, Anna, let's just jump right into the conversation. I wanted to ask you, can you tell us a little bit about your journey as a film critic and also, the world's most committed feminist? So, I'm sure it's been a bit of a journey getting to that point, right? Like, when did you decide that you wanted to hold the content that we're really consuming to a higher pedestal? So, can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Well, I think I must have been a feminist in my mother's womb because my mother was a fierce feminist. I don't think she ever used that word to describe herself because she was a woman born in the 1930s. And in fact, my mom was much older than the friends, friends' parents, because mom and dad had a late marriage. But even that, the fact that she had a late marriage, she was working until then, she had kids like at an age which is very rare even now in India, but unthinkable back then. All of those things, I think, without mom and dad ever being conscious of the global feminist movement or the Indian feminist movement per se, they gave us a feminist upbringing. So conversations at home, it was just the most natural thing in the world. We would talk about politics and religion, and I have memories of myself as a little kid having arguments with my grandfather, mom, dad. And the most beautiful thing was that my parents never said a subject was too adult for a child to discuss. You know, if there was something that they didn't want us to see, I'm assuming they just never kept it in the house because there were just books lying around all over the place. And nobody ever said, I think I was 8 years old when I picked up Wuthering Heights and read it. And no one ever said, oh God, this is, I mean, you're 8, you're not going to understand it. And honestly, I'm not 100% sure what I understood back then, but I did understand something. And I remember reading Gone with the Wind at the same age. And again, you know, it's not like I was educated in race relations in North America, but I remember being confused about who the bad guy and the good guy in the book were. And I remember asking my mother that. And I look back now because there's been so much conversation around this because of the Black Lives Matter movement becoming prominent worldwide. I remember asking my mother, and my mom explained to me that there is a problem with the book because, of course, the way Margaret Mitchell writes, it's so detailed and descriptive and fascinating, and you get lost in her world. But there is a problem with the politics of the book because she has sympathy for slavery, and she's making it out to be this very benevolent system where the master and the slave have a sweet equation and stuff like that. And now I look back and think, it became a big deal last year, and there was so much conversation about having, should the film be pulled down from networks and things like that. And this is something my mother talked to me about in the 1980s. And my mother wasn't a great, well-known academic or anything. She was just a great human being. So I think the foundations for feminism were laid as a child, and so everything I've done since then. And the moment I entered my profession, my consciousness, my awareness of all of these issues, I think I had a very heightened sense of justice. I may not have been educated about all issues, because I think that, for instance, my understanding of the LGBT plus community came more from people I met after I started working. But feminism is in every cell of my being, and so I cannot look at cinema and not look at it through a feminist lens, because in any case, I think to not do so is silly. I think it's to not look at as at cinema as a political enterprise is to look at it as a half picture. So just logically speaking, that's the way cinema, I feel, has to be naturally viewed. But for me anyway, I mean, I can't help it. That's just me.
Wow, that's amazing. To add to what you just mentioned, Anna, you grew up in a space where you were given an agency as an individual right from a very young age, and it was a democratic space. Now, when we come to pop culture, especially something that's as commercial and as populist as cinema, most often when we write reviews about films, I think this is something that you might also have gotten very often. Why don't these feminists just chill? Why do you have to make a mountain of a molehill? Why can't this just be entertainment or take a joke? These are things that feminist film critics always get thrown at them. So, in this context as well, I would like to ask you, and I'm also asking you this because, particularly because you're also a person who's very, very particular about terminologies. Like, you refuse to use the term regional cinema because you say there is an element of discrimination right in the semantics of it. So, in this context, when looking at you as a film critique, as a feminist film critic, I would like to ask you, why do you think it is important to view pop culture through a feminist lens? Why shouldn't feminists just chill?
Well, how do you chill when the discrimination and the marginalization is a part of your life? And if it is not part of your personal lived experience, but you are aware that it is a part of someone else's experience, then how can you ignore it? Can you be so selfish as to say, because I'm a woman, I want films to be, I will look at films through a feminist lens, but I don't care about caste representation because I am not Dalit. So I just think it's a part of the world. How can one not acknowledge the existence of issues that exist in the world? And a lot of the time, when I remember that I was speaking to Ramesh Sippy a few years ago, and I interviewed him, and he said, I have to make films on the stories that come naturally to me. And my point to him and to anybody always is, why is it that the stories that come naturally to you are the stories of upper caste men in India? Why is it that you do not look around you and see that the natural world is not that? You and I do not even have to imagine, because around us, we are seeing diversity. So when films are marginalizing people, firstly, they're ignoring even the reality that is around them. Secondly, why would you limit yourself only to your own social circle or your own community? Why are you not looking at the world beyond? And of course, I think, Nishtha and Sukanya, that even as film critics, even as journalists, we must also constantly introspect. Why is it that it took me longer to get to writing on caste than it took me to writing about women? Why is it that from day one, I was always fighting for space for women and writings on women. Why is it that I didn't fight that fight initially over caste? It's not because I'm a bad human being, but it is because I think it is because my experiences, I had not suffered the way a person who is born Dalit has suffered. And suffering doesn't necessarily, even if a person is born into a family that has escaped the poverty that India's lower castes have to deal with, there is still the discrimination. It is everywhere. I hear this question a lot nowadays. Why are Dalits angry all the time? How can you, I mean, this is the in this is inherited memory, this is a knowledge of history, it is a combination of so many things. And I acknowledge that, of course, in certain areas I'm not speaking from lived experience, but I feel it's important for us to try and educate ourselves. But in certain areas I am speaking from lived experience. So for instance, when I write about the film Sherni, the Hindi film Sherni, when I speak about the stereotyping of the Christian community that I noticed from the time I was a child. I used to find it so weird that every Christian in Hindi cinema was the gangster Robert, and was a drunkard who was like swaying around in a drunken state, or was the cabaret dancer Lily or Rosie. And I have nothing against cabaret dancers, but if the filmmaker didn't have anything against cabaret dancers, then why was that filmmaker assigning that profession only to a particular minority community? So when I wrote about Sherni and the fact that, my God, like, first you had this stereotyping, and then for about 20, 30 years, the Christian community just disappeared. It's like, oh, you don't serve any purpose anymore because now Hindi filmmakers are putting their Hindu heroines into tiny clothes, and they're making their Hindu heroines also have sex. So then they feel that Christians don't serve a purpose because that's the only purpose that Christian women ever served for them. So they just discarded the community. And here is an Amit Masurkar who's giving us a Christian heroine, a Malayali Christian heroine, and that too a Malayali Christian married to a Hindu North Indian. She's a successful professional and defying all stereotypes, not interested in having children, and she has a husband who supports her in that. I think it's impossible to not view cinema through a feminist lens if you are aware of the reality around you. It's impossible not to view cinema through a political lens in general, where you're conscious of race and sexual orientation and caste and religious minorities and the majority and the politics that goes with all of this, because it's the reality around us and we're seeing it, and we're either living it and personally touched by it, or at least it is a part of the real world. And unless you want to wear blinkers and not care, how can you, like, what fantasy world are you looking at that you, I mean, how, why keep, why pretend that this is not the reality?
Anna, you also had to tell us about your aversion from the with the term regional cinema.
Oh, yes. Well, I think that I again, of course, this again is something that comes to me naturally. I am a Malayali born and brought up in Delhi. I obviously, therefore, had very easy exposure to English and Hindi. Educating myself in Hindi was not difficult at all because one had to study the language in school. Why are you and I deprived of an education in our mother tongues if we are not living in the state where that mother tongue is the official language? And as far as regional goes, I mean, just even factually, the minute you say regional cinema, you are unstated in that term is the assumption that there is such a thing as a national cinema. Now, that obviously, then you are, without saying it, claiming that Hindi cinema is national cinema. What does that even mean? That's such a ridiculous position to take. And why does that Hindi cinema is national cinema attitude come? Because of this widespread notion that Hindi is India's national language, which again is a result of 70 years of propaganda that has convinced large parts of the country, including non Hindi speaking parts of the country, that Hindi is the national language when India doesn't have a national language. The Delhi and Bombay media, mainstream media by and large, have ignored most Indian cinemas other than Hindi cinema. And even now, they've suddenly woken up to the beauty of Malayalam cinema, because the public has forced them to acknowledge Malayalam cinema. Because in the pandemic, the public was watching so much cinema on OTT platforms, and they realized, oh my god, here is this industry making these fabulous films. And so they discovered Malayalam cinema on their own, and they compelled the media to cover it. But otherwise, they weren't covering Malayalam cinema. The Delhi and Bombay media's notion idea of covering Tamil cinema was one Rajnikant. And if you had an argument with an editor, they would also say, "But we covered Bahubali, yaar. What are you saying?" So, like, India, India produces 1,600 to about 2,500 films a year, and you use this term regional cinema to marginalize all cinemas other than Hindi cinema, and to justify your bias, to justify your disinterest in investing in film critics for cinema of all languages. And you end up giving, therefore, more prominence to Hindi cinema. And that prominence is free marketing. That free marketing means more Hindi film actors are brand ambassadors for products, which means more visibility for them, which means they become even bigger stars than were earlier, which means their appeal across the country in states that are not Hindi speaking states also increase, which means you get a reason for justifying your initial little game in the first place. Why are you denying Indians the length and breadth and the entire expanse and the beauty of Indian cinema? We should be proud of the fact that we are the only country in the world that has multiple film production centers. You can call them film industries or production centers, producing films in multiple languages. We are the country that produces the largest number of films in the world, and our own people have worked so hard to keep that information from the rest of the world, and to convince the rest of the world that all Indian cinema is Bollywood.
Like the name of the show suggests, we're talking about intersectional feminism, and part of that is different identities and not the sort of homogeneous identity that is often, shown in media, and why just media, in many different spaces. I think homogeneous identities tend to occupy a lot of spaces, and that sort of leads me to my next question, Anna, is that right now, not just representation on screen, and when I say on screen, then going off of what you said about marketing and about general visibility in the media, right now it's extremely homogeneous, not just with what's visible to us, but also of other differing identities. So, in terms of, say, sexuality and caste, it's just so limited. But how much of a distance do you think all films in India need to travel in order to become, I mean, I think completely intersectional is a while. I'll concede to that, but at least even slightly more intersectional. And not just on screen, not just with the names we are seeing on screen, but also with the larger process of decision making that actually goes into making these mammoth creations, so directing and writing and creation of characters who really get portrayed. How much more do we have to travel before it starts gaining even some semblance of intersectionality?
Oh, because of the nature of humankind, that's such a difficult question, because I think the answer is that we should never be satisfied, because every time a community gets to a place where it is past its marginalization, I think there will be someone else to marginalize. Humankind is like that. We seem to constantly need someone to exploit. As a result of that, our popular culture will also end up reflecting that. So the battle, I think, will never end. But the fact that it is being fought, and it is being fought increasingly vocally, and the fact that we have spaces now that were not available to our parents' generation, is a huge deal. There are things you and I can say now. This podcast, for instance, 50 years ago, how could we have recorded this so easily sitting in our homes, right, in two different cities? Or the social media, where a member of the public can air grievances and directly tell a filmmaker that their representation of a Dalit woman character in a film was perfectly unacceptable. Now, I want to just talk to you about two films, because I mentioned the film Sherni earlier, which is a Hindi film, and I want to mention a film called Madati, a Tamil film that has just released on Stream. Um, in Sherni, in addition to I spoke of the Malayali Christian heroine, there is also a very interesting Muslim character. My disappointment with that film, I think The Cheney is a beautiful film, but my disappointment with it is, there is a character called Jyoti. Okay, she belongs to one of the tribal communities and is acted by this really very interesting actress called Sampa Mandal. And honestly, because of she's so charismatic and she comes on screen and she's so powerful, and they give her a presence from the beginning itself, that I was expecting that she would be the most important character in the film after Vidya Vincent's character, as in Vidya Balan's character, Vidya Vincent. And yet somehow she recedes into the background. So in the proceedings, her actions are crucial, but her screen time is very limited. So now, of course, then the question arises, should I be condemning Sherni outright and just brushing it aside? I'm going to say absolutely no, because at a time when the Hindi film industry seems to be bizarrely hesitant and almost afraid to say the word caste, here is a film that is acknowledging the existence, okay, of communities and giving several communities prominence within its storyline. So no, absolutely I'm not going to reject it, but our goal has to be the films where, I mean, when are we going to see a Hindi film where Jyoti is the heroine, played by Sampa Mandal, right? Or, you know, the film Article 15. When are we going to see a film in which that Azad character, played by Mohammad Zishan Ayub, is the leading character? I mean, that character is an extremely interesting character, and to me, the most interesting part of the film, because he had agency. It's not that, although the hero was a Hindu Brahmin hero, it's not like he was the leader of the Dalit movement. The movement was being led by the Dalit community itself. Okay, and so contrast this with a Dhadak, which was a remake of the Marathi film Sairat, and the Marathi film Sairat is about a killing because an upper caste woman and a lower caste man fall in love and marry, and Dhadak is, you know, the Hindi cinema remakes it as Dhadak and virtually erases the caste element from it. How does that make any sense? Marathi, Leena Manimekalai's film, which is on a knee stream. This is a film where the leads are the oppressed community, and they are the front and center of the proceedings in the film. It's not that you show them only to show oppression. You show their lives, you show their relationships, you show the characters' fears, their joys, their love for each other. So, you know, when I was saying, when are we going to see a Hindi film where an Azad or a Jyoti are the hero and the heroine? We're seeing it happening in other Indian cinemas. So this is not to say that Tamil is perfect or that Malayalam cinema is perfect. Far from it. Like I said, the battle will never be over. But if Tamil cinema, if Paranjit can do what he's doing in a mainstream commercial space in Tamil cinema, what are Hindi filmmakers afraid of?
Absolutely. Adding to that, Anna, so when we speak about intersectionality and caste and gender in the context of popular culture, I think we can also notice a trend of how these topics become very, sensational, and how these are topics that have been trending, so to say, in quotes, and everybody wants to make a politically informed film. Everybody wants to make a feminist film. There's a lot of forced wokeness, so to say, if we look at content that's coming around, for various reasons. And sometimes what happens is that this forced wokeness does not come from a space of genuine allyship. It comes from a space of, let's say, savior complex, or just to capitalize on the woke conversation that's happening and things like that. So in your review of Sherni, also, you have written about how the intersectional backgrounds of the protagonists don't give you a speech about how this is how ideally it should be, or this is why this country is secular. It doesn't border on to that sort of jingoism. It's not trying to make a statement, but it's just existing, and it adds a lot of life and layer and reality to the premise of the story. Also, similarly, in a recent review of yours about this Malayalam anthology on gender called Anum Pennum, you have written about a film that stars Parvati in the lead. It's called Rachiamma, where she is also a tribal woman. And that film also got into a lot of trouble because an actor like Parvati was cast as a tribal woman who was markedly very dark, of very dark skin color in the short story that the film is based on. So, when we look at a lot of representations in popular culture, we sometimes feel that, oh, is this because being woke is in style now, or is it because they will be able to sort of capitalize on this conversation, or do they actually come from a genuine space of allyship? So when you review these kind of content, what do you feel? How do you look at this whole? Do you think that we sometimes border on to savior complexes, or we sometimes are a little ingenuine in our efforts to sort of seem woke?
This is an issue worldwide. By the way, it's not just here in India. There is this film called The Green Book, which won an Oscar, and I'm just amazed that as part of this whole Oscars so white campaign and a fight to give more space to films about people from other races. You end up awarding and rewarding a film that has such a massive savior complex. The white man in the film makes the black man become aware of himself and is the reason for him growing as a person through the film. It was so condescending. And there is this Hindi film just around the time that Cherny was released, a film called Shadistan that was made. And you know you can just make out that somebody sitting in a conference room said somewhere, yeah, feminism is selling these days, so let us pick up a film on feminism. Because the writing, the characters in the film were basically giving speeches throughout to each other. And this film's definition of a feminist seems to be a woman who will be condescending and patronizing towards another woman who has made choices different from hers. And I don't believe, by the way, that we have to respect everyone's choices. You don't have to respect everyone's choices. You have to respect people's right to make choices that you do not respect. Okay? You can disagree very strongly, but the condescension that the leading lady shows towards another woman because she is a stay-at-home wife and mother, and she is extreme, like she's almost scared of her husband, etc. And then in turn they make that woman condescending towards the heroine. The heroine is then in turn condescending towards her. So this whole projection of feminism as a battle among women, the women who consider themselves better than other women, that's how it is presented. All right.
I just want to cut in for 1 second and let our listeners know that you can't see us. Obviously, this is a podcast, but we are literally jumping in our seats because of how vehemently we agree with what's being said. I can hardly sit straight right now because I'm like, yes, that is true. Sorry, Anna.
But if you look at Venu's, because you mentioned Arnam Bennam, and it's an anthology, and Rachiyamma is one of the stories in the anthology based on, for readers who don't know, it's based on a short story by the legendary Malayalam writer Uru. And it's a very complex story. A lot of people, not everyone, but there are many people in Kerala who think that it wasn't correctly interpreted by the director Venu. But interpretation, I mean, we can argue about that till kingdom come. But just specifically about the casting of Parvati as the character Rachiyamma. Now, I think if you watch Venu's films and listen to him speak outside his cinema, he comes across as a decent human being. Okay, so I don't think that he is somebody who has the attitude of that Shadistan. I certainly don't think that Venu thought, oh, let me take up a feminist film because it's the thing to do these days. I don't think so at all. But very often people take the issue of representation and color and blackface and brownface in cinema very literally. For instance, Parvati, who I think without question is one of the most politically aware and courageous actors in this country, one of the most vocal and bravest actors in this country. Parvati, when she was confronted with the question of why she was playing a character who, in the short story, was very, very clearly described as a dark skinned woman, and her dark skin was a defining characteristic as far as the writer is concerned. And Parvati is not dark skinned. She said that because it's fiction, it's open to interpretation. But yes, if it was based on a true story and the character was in real life a person who's dark skinned, then she would not be willing to play that. But I think that this is something, if I get a chance to have a conversation with Parvati about, I would certainly tell her this. But I've mentioned this in the review. You see, why is it that Venu couldn't find a woman who is as big a star as Parvati to play the role of Rachiamma, who would match the physical characteristics as described by Urub? Because Malayalam cinema, by and large, does not give space to dark skinned women. And of course, this applies to Indian cinemas across the country. Mainstream commercial cinemas across India do not give space to dark skinned actors, primarily women actors. You cannot, as a filmmaker, wash your hands of this and say, well, I couldn't find someone of the same stature. Why haven't you played a role in your industry rethinking its attitude towards skin color when it recruits women actors? Why is that? Now, so this is the problem, is not just with representation on screen, it's also with representation among the in the acting community. Why is it? And you spoke about earlier, you spoke about people who are making the decisions. Why is it that automatically most big producers are gravitating towards stories of upper caste Hindu men? Because that's what most producers are themselves. And there are so many occasions on which I've had producers tell me, but this is what the audience wants. And if anything, like the past year and a half has shown us that the audience is being underestimated by producers and exhibitors who are viewing them, the audience, very narrowly based on the producers and exhibitors' own biases. Because the audience across India has embraced Malayalam cinema. Although Malayalam is not a language spoken from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, The Great Indian Kitchen was a film that was rejected by Netflix and Amazon Prime and major TV channels in Kerala, and was compelled to come on a brand new streaming platform called Stream. And just word of mouth on that film built up and built up and built up and built up. And ultimately, it was again picked up by a mainstream platform because it just became so huge. And the audience, therefore, was rejecting the claim that the industry constantly makes about what the audience wants to see.
Anna, it's really interesting how you actually talked about the audiences moving away from the general perception that producers have had for so long that, the audience only want this and only want that. There's been such a huge opening up of the sort of content that we're actually consuming with like OTT and social media, and you no longer need like these big launches of these big actors from these big production houses to get people to watch your content. It's good, it's word of mouth. And especially in the pandemic, I mean, not to I definitely don't want to be one of those people who's like, look at the sunshine and rainbows of this, it was devastating. But we did see this sort of pattern in the consumption of content, and that really has opened up, hasn't it?
Well, it has opened up, but of course, one shouldn't. It's not that the world is perfect yet. Even now, for instance, Netflix, which had rejected The Great Indian Kitchen, went and showed another film by the same director that is not one tenth as good, simply because there was so much word of mouth about The Great Indian Kitchen. But that film, which is called Kilometers and Kilometers, stars Tovino Thomas, and so they must have thought, it's more mainstream, commercial, and it's the same director, so it will. But it isn't one tenth as good a film as The Great Indian Kitchen. But again, with The Great Indian Kitchen, it was the content that they had an issue with. It was the politics of the film that they had an issue with, because Suraj Venjaramood and Nimisha Sajian are popular actors. So they were not willing to push the envelope in the in the present political atmosphere that we're in. But yes, there has been a greater democratization than there was earlier. Even now, there is considerable gatekeeping. Why is it that a Marathi is on knee stream and is not on Netflix or Amazon Prime or on Hotstar? It's because of the content. And in addition to that, of course, they will argue that, Semmalar Anam and Ajmina Kasim, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing their names perfectly, but they might argue that they are not mainstream, big commercial stars. But how do stars get made? Everybody was starting out at some point, right? So if everyone involved doesn't look for opportunities to give breaks to newer people, newer faces, people who belong to the communities that don't have representation among the acting fraternity in the country, people whose looks aren't what is conventionally considered good looking, as far as our stereotype of beauty is concerned. If nobody gives a break to such persons, then how will we ever change things? And it's the easiest thing in the world to say, I will only give what the audience wants. But how about steering the audience towards acquiring new tastes? How about testing the audience so that you get a pleasant surprise like a Great Indian Kitchen?
So yes, so we did speak about a lot of important touch points in about popular cinema and popular culture with our most committed feminist in the world, film critic and journalist Anna M.M. Vetticad. This has been such a this has been I'm sure this will set a really really nice tone to our season where we will be speaking all things pop culture. Thank you, Anna. It was a pleasure to have you on our podcast, and we had a lot of fun talking to you. I hope you also had fun talking to us.
I had a lot of fun, Nishtha and Sukanya, and we could have gone on for another hour. It's just that you can't have an endless, unending podcast, and I have work, so I have to go.
No, absolutely. And again, thank you so much, Anna, for coming on our show. It really does mean so much to us that you took out the time and inside jokes, the extra time to come and speak to us today. Um, uh, like I completely echo Sukanya's statement that we could not have had a better start to our season. And to everybody who's been listening to us, thank you so very much for tuning in. And we will be back next to next Thursday with a new episode. So do make sure that you catch that as well. Thank you.